It was just another cold, busy evening in the city. People rushed to and from work, their faces tired from a long day, their thoughts preoccupied with worries, plans, and routines. The bus was packed, every seat taken, and the standing passengers swayed slightly with each stop. Among them was a 17-year-old boy named Marcus. He had just finished his shift at the local grocery store, his backpack slung over his shoulder, his body aching from stacking shelves all day. Marcus was used to long commutes. He usually kept to himself, listening to music or scrolling through his phone, but tonight, something made him look up. Across from him, a woman stepped onto the bus, one hand gripping the metal pole for balance, the other resting gently on her stomach. She was visibly pregnant, her tired eyes scanning the crowded space for an empty seat. No one moved. People glanced at her and then quickly looked away, pretending not to notice. Marcus didn't hesitate. Without thinking twice, he stood up and motioned for her to take his seat. "Ma'am, you can sit here," he said, offering a small, polite smile. The woman looked surprised. For a moment, she hesitated, as if she wasn't sure whether to accept. Then, with a grateful nod, she lowered herself into the seat. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice carrying a mix of exhaustion and relief. Marcus simply nodded, adjusting his backpack and gripping the overhead rail to steady himself as the bus lurched forward. He didn't think much of the gesture, it was just the right thing to do. But a few minutes later, he felt a light tap on his arm. He turned to see the woman handing him a small, folded piece of paper. "Read this later," she said with a mysterious smile before turning her gaze out the window. Marcus took the note, curiosity flickering in his eyes. What could it be? A simple thank you? A kind word? He slipped it into his pocket, deciding to read it when he got home. But he had no idea that those few words on that tiny piece of paper were about to change his life forever. The city bus rattled through the streets, headlights reflecting off the wet pavement as people crowded inside, eager to get home. It was one of those evenings where exhaustion hung in the air, the kind where no one wanted to make eye contact, where everyone was lost in their own world, counting down the minutes until they could step off and breathe freely again. Among the passengers was Marcus, a 17-year-old high school senior, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his fingers tapping absent-mindedly on his phone screen. His day had been long, school, followed by a part-time shift at the grocery store, and now, this long ride home. His feet ached, his eyelids felt heavy, but he didn't complain. This was his routine, the rhythm of his life. The bus jerked to a stop, and the doors hissed open. A few people shuffled out, and a handful of new passengers stepped in. Among them was a woman, blonde hair pulled into a messy bun, a heavy coat wrapped around her frame, and a noticeable curve to her stomach. She was pregnant, and by the tired look in her eyes, it was clear she needed to sit down. Her gaze swept over the bus, searching for an empty seat, but every spot was taken. People saw her. Marcus knew they did. But no one moved. Some stared at their phones, pretending not to notice, while others looked away, unwilling to offer up their comfort. Marcus didn't even think about it. He had been raised better than that. Without hesitation, he stood up, gripping the metal bar for support as he motioned toward the seat. "Ma'am, you can sit here," he said, his voice polite but firm. The woman's eyes flickered with surprise, and for a brief moment, she hesitated, as if she wasn't used to kindness from strangers. Then a small, appreciative smile appeared on her lips, and she carefully lowered herself into the seat. "Thank you," she murmured, exhaling as if she had been holding her breath. Marcus nodded and shifted his weight, steadying himself as the bus rumbled forward again. He didn't expect anything in return, he hadn't done it for that. It was just the right thing to do. But a few minutes later, he felt a light tap on his arm. He turned to see the woman holding out a small, folded piece of paper. "Read this later," she said, her tone gentle but filled with something else, something Marcus couldn't quite place. Curious, he took the note and slipped it into his pocket. It was just a piece of paper, simple and unassuming, but for some reason, his heart beat a little faster. What could it say? A simple thank you? A few kind words? He wouldn't know until he opened it. But what he didn't realize in that moment was that whatever was written on that note was about to change his life forever. Marcus tightened his grip on the overhead rail as the bus swayed with the rhythm of the city. He could feel the folded note in his pocket, its edges crisp against his fingertips. A part of him wanted to pull it out and read it right away, but something held him back. Maybe it was the way the woman had looked at him when she handed it over, like it was more than just a simple thank you, like it carried weight. He glanced at her out of the corner of his eye. She sat quietly, one hand resting gently on her belly, the other gripping her purse. Her face looked worn, not just with exhaustion but with something deeper. Worry maybe. Or sadness. She kept staring out the window, lost in thought, as if the world outside held answers she couldn't find. The bus made another stop and more people squeezed inside. Marcus shifted his stance, adjusting his backpack on his shoulder. The ride home always felt long, but tonight it felt even longer. His mind kept drifting back to the note. Why had she given it to him? What could she possibly have to say that couldn't be spoken aloud? His phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him out of his thoughts. He pulled it out. His mom. "Where are you?" Marcus sighed. He knew that text came with an unspoken message. Hurry up. Get home. Stay safe. His mom worried about him, especially when he was out late. He quickly typed back. On the bus. Almost home. He tucked his phone away and exhaled. His mom always said the world wasn't fair, and maybe she was right. He had learned that lesson too many times to count. But she had also taught him to be kind anyway, to do the right thing even when no one was watching. That's why he gave up his seat. It wasn't for recognition, wasn't for some reward. It was just how he was raised. The bus rolled to another stop, and the woman suddenly shifted in her seat. Marcus noticed the way she sat up straighter, how her fingers tightened around her purse strap. Her eyes flickered toward the doors, as if she were debating whether to get off. But she didn't move. Instead, she let out a small breath and leaned back again, her expression unreadable. Marcus felt a strange tension in the air. He didn't know why, but something about the way she acted made him uneasy. Was she afraid of something? Or someone? The bus continued on, weaving through the city, headlights flashing past the windows. Marcus glanced at his reflection in the glass, his own face looking just as tired as he felt. Then finally his stop came. He pulled the cord, and the bus slowed to a halt. As he stepped toward the doors, he hesitated for just a second. He turned back, looking at the woman one last time. She was already watching him. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, there was something unspoken between them. Gratitude, maybe, or something else. Then the doors hissed open, and Marcus stepped off. The cold air hit him immediately, sharp against his skin. He pulled his hoodie up and started walking down the sidewalk, his footsteps echoing against the quiet streets. The city lights glowed in the distance, but his neighborhood was mostly still, the occasional car passing by, the faint sound of music drifting from a window somewhere. His house wasn't far, just a few blocks away. But with every step he took, his mind stayed on that note. He couldn't wait any longer. He reached into his pocket, pulled it out, and unfolded the paper under the dim glow of a street lamp. His eyes scanned the words, and as soon as he read them, his breath caught in his throat. I need your help. Please. That was it. 4 words. No explanation. No details. Just a plea. Marcus stared at the note, his heart pounding a little harder. He looked around as if expecting to see the woman standing there, watching him. But the street was empty. His mind raced with questions. What kind of help did she need? Was she in danger? Why would she ask him, a total stranger? He thought about going back to the bus stop, but by now, the bus was long gone, swallowed up by the night. He had no way to reach her. No name. No phone number. Nothing. He stuffed the note back into his pocket and kept walking, but the unease in his chest didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger. Something told him this wasn't over. Marcus walked faster, his breath coming in short bursts as the cold air stung his face. The note felt heavier in his pocket, like it carried something more than just ink on paper. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Why had she chosen him? Out of everyone on that bus, why him? His house came into view, a small, worn-down place with a flickering porch light. His mom's car was parked outside, which meant she was home. He sighed, trying to push the thoughts aside as he climbed the steps and unlocked the door. The warmth of the house wrapped around him, the faint smell of something fried lingering in the air. You're late, his mom called from the kitchen. Her voice was tired but firm, the way it always was when she worried. Bus took forever, Marcus replied, dropping his backpack near the door. He walked into the kitchen, where his mom was wiping down the counter, her eyes flicking to him with that look she always gave, half relief, half frustration. "You eat yet?" she asked. "I'm good." She studied him for a second, like she could tell something was on his mind. "You sure?" "Yeah." He wasn't sure if she believed him, but she let it go. "Get some rest." "School's early," she said, turning back to the sink. Marcus nodded and headed to his room. As soon as he closed the door, he pulled the note out again, staring at the words. "I need your help. Please." He ran his thumb over the paper, as if feeling the ink would somehow make the meaning clearer. He thought about ignoring it. He didn't know this woman. Whatever she was going through, it wasn't his problem. But something about the way she had looked at him, the urgency in her eyes, made it impossible to forget. He sat on his bed, tapping his foot against the floor. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe she had written that note for someone else and changed her mind at the last second. Maybe she regretted it the moment she handed it to him. Or maybe she really needed help. His fingers hovered over his phone. He had no way of contacting her, no idea who she even was. But he knew where he had last seen her, the bus. The next evening, Marcus took the same bus at the same time, hoping to see her again. The bus was just as crowded as before, the same tired faces, the same hurried energy. His eyes scanned the seats, but she wasn't there. He rode the bus all the way to the last stop, hoping maybe she would get on somewhere along the way. But she didn't. As the bus emptied out, Marcus sighed, slumping slightly in his seat. Maybe he was reading too much into this. Maybe she was fine. Just as he was about to stand up, he noticed something, a man near the back of the bus, watching him. Not in a casual way, not like someone lost in thought. No, this was different. The man's eyes stayed locked on Marcus, unblinking. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. The man was older, maybe in his 40s, with a sharp face and a stiff posture. He didn't look away, not even when Marcus met his gaze. The bus came to a stop, and the driver announced the final destination. Marcus hesitated before getting up, but when he did, so did the man. Marcus stepped off the bus, his heart pounding now. He could hear the man's footsteps behind him, steady and unhurried. He didn't look back. He didn't want to. He turned the corner, picking up his pace. The street was mostly empty, just dim streetlights and closed storefronts. He could still hear the footsteps. Then suddenly they stopped. Marcus turned around. The man was gone. His chest rose and fell quickly as he scanned the street, but there was nothing. No sign of him. Just the stillness of the night. Marcus swallowed hard and started walking again, forcing himself to breathe. He didn't know who that man was or why he had been following him. But he knew one thing for sure. This was bigger than just a note. Marcus walked faster, his heart hammering in his chest. He kept glancing over his shoulder, but the man was still gone. It didn't make sense. 1 second, he had been there, following Marcus step for step. The next, he had vanished like he was never there at all. But Marcus knew what he had seen. And he knew that wasn't normal. By the time he reached his house, his palms were sweaty, and his mind was racing. He fumbled with his keys, trying to steady his breathing, but even as he stepped inside and locked the door behind him, he didn't feel safe. The house was quiet, his mom was probably asleep. The soft hum of the refrigerator was the only sound filling the space. He leaned against the door, exhaling slowly. The note was still in his pocket. He pulled it out, reading the words again, as if they would suddenly make sense. "I need your help. Please." He had so many questions, but no answers. Who was that man? Was he connected to the woman? Was she in trouble? Marcus didn't sleep much that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he kept thinking about the way the woman had looked at him, the way she had hesitated before giving him the note. It was like she had been scared. And now, after what had just happened, Marcus was starting to think she had every reason to be. The next day, he couldn't focus at school. His mind kept drifting back to the bus, to the note, to the man who had followed him. He told himself he should drop it, let it go, but something in his gut wouldn't let him. So after school, he took the bus again. This time, he wasn't just looking for the woman, he was also looking for the man. Every time the bus stopped, he scanned the crowd, his eyes searching for any sign of them. Then, halfway through the ride, his heart nearly stopped. She was there, sitting near the back, staring out the window. Marcus hesitated for only a second before making his way toward her. He sat in the seat across from hers, waiting for her to notice him. It didn't take long. Her eyes flickered toward him, and for a brief moment, something unreadable passed over her face. Then she looked away. Marcus cleared his throat. "I got your note." His voice was quiet, careful. She didn't react right away. Then, slowly, she turned back toward him. Her face was pale, and up close, Marcus could see the dark circles under her eyes, like she hadn't slept in days. "I was hoping you'd just forget about it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus frowned. "But you asked for help." She let out a shaky breath and glanced around the bus, as if checking to see if anyone was listening. When she spoke again, her voice was even lower. "I shouldn't have. I made a mistake." Marcus could feel the tension in her words, the way her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the strap of her bag. "Are you in trouble?" he asked. She hesitated. Then, just as she was about to speak, her eyes widened in fear. Marcus followed her gaze. The man was on the bus. He was standing near the front, his sharp eyes scanning the rows of passengers. The woman grabbed Marcus's wrist, her grip tight and desperate. "Get off at the next stop," she whispered.
"Now."
Marcus didn't have time to think. The bus slowed, and as soon as the doors opened, he and the woman slipped out onto the sidewalk. The moment they were off, she started walking fast, pulling him along with her. He could hear the bus doors closing behind them, the engine roaring as it pulled away. Then he heard footsteps. Marcus turned. The man had followed them. Panic shot through him, but the woman tightened her grip on his arm.
"Come on," she said.
"We have to run." Marcus didn't ask questions. He just ran. Marcus ran, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts as his feet pounded against the pavement. The woman clung to his arm, pulling him along, her grip firm despite the panic in her eyes. Behind them, the man's footsteps were steady, unhurried, like he knew they had nowhere to go. They turned a corner, dodging past pedestrians, but the city didn't care about their fear. The streets kept moving, people lost in their own worlds, unaware of the danger just feet away. The woman suddenly yanked Marcus into a narrow alley, pressing her back against the brick wall. She held a finger to her lips, signaling for him to stay quiet. He struggled to catch his breath listening. The man's footsteps slowed. Then nothing. For a moment, the only sound was the distant hum of traffic. Marcus swallowed hard. "Who is he?" he whispered. The woman shook her head, her face tense. "I don't know his name, but he's been following me for weeks." Marcus's mind raced. This wasn't just some random situation. This was planned. The note, the way she had looked at him on the bus, her fear, it all pointed to something bigger than he had imagined. "Why me?" Marcus asked, his voice barely audible. "Why did you ask me for help?" Her lips parted, but before she could answer, a shadow passed at the entrance of the alley. Marcus's stomach dropped. The man was there. He didn't move right away. He just stood at the edge of the alley, his silhouette dark against the city lights. Marcus could feel the weight of his stare, the silent threat in his presence. The woman gripped Marcus's wrist tighter. "Run." Before Marcus could react, she bolted, pulling him with her as they sprinted through the alley, weaving between dumpsters and crates. The man followed, his footsteps faster now. He wasn't waiting anymore. He was coming for them. They burst out onto another street, nearly colliding with a passing car. Horns blared. Someone yelled. But there was no time to stop. The woman dragged Marcus down another block, past a row of old buildings until she suddenly veered into a dimly lit diner. The bell above the door jingled as they stepped inside, breathless. The warm smell of coffee and grilled food filled the air, a stark contrast to the cold fear gripping Marcus's chest. A tired-looking waitress glanced up from behind the counter, barely acknowledging them before turning back to her order pad. The woman pulled Marcus into a booth at the far end, her hands shaking as she gripped the table. "He won't come in here," she whispered, her eyes darting toward the window. Marcus turned, heart still racing. The man was outside. He didn't enter. He just stood there, watching. Marcus's hands curled into fists. What does he want? The woman closed her eyes for a second, then looked at Marcus, really looked at him. And for the first time, Marcus saw something beneath the fear.
Guilt.
"You need to know the truth," she said. "I didn't pick you by accident." Marcus stiffened. You don't know me, she continued, but I know who you are. Marcus felt a chill crawl up his spine. What are you talking about? She exhaled shakily, glancing toward the window one last time before leaning in closer. I'm sorry, Marcus, but this started long before you got on that bus. Marcus stared at the woman, his pulse hammering in his ears. You know who I am? His voice came out quieter than he expected, almost like he was afraid of the answer. She nodded slowly, her eyes flicking toward the window again, making sure the man was still outside. He hadn't moved, hadn't looked away. Marcus swallowed hard. Then tell me. She hesitated, then took a deep breath. Your father, she whispered. Marcus felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. His father? That didn't make sense. His father was gone. Left years ago. No contact, no explanations. Just disappeared like he never existed. And Marcus had spent most of his life trying not to think about him. But now, here was this woman, this stranger, telling him this had something to do with him. What do you mean? Marcus asked, his voice sharp. What does my father have to do with this? The woman lowered her voice even more. I don't know the full story, but I know this: your father was involved in something. Something dangerous. And I think this man outside? He's looking for you, because of him. Marcus's mind was spinning. His father had been gone for nearly a decade. How could anything he did still matter? That doesn't make sense, Marcus said. I don't even know my father. I know, the woman said. That's why I left you that note. Because I knew you didn't. And because I owe him. Marcus narrowed his eyes. Owe him? The woman sighed, running a shaky hand through her hair. Your father saved my life. Years ago. And before he left, he made me promise that if anything ever happened to him, I would look out for you. Marcus felt like he was floating, like the whole world had just flipped upside down. His father had asked someone to protect him, even after abandoning him. But I don't need protection, Marcus said, shaking his head. I'm fine. My life is normal. Or, at least it was, until you handed me that note. The woman's expression turned pained. I thought you were safe. I never planned to involve you. But then I saw him. She nodded toward the man outside. And I knew it was only a matter of time before he found you. Marcus turned to look at the man again. He hadn't moved. He was still standing outside, still waiting. Marcus exhaled sharply, his hands gripping the edge of the table. What does he want? The woman hesitated again, and that was all the answer Marcus needed. You know, he said, realization dawning on him. You know why he's after me. She closed her eyes for a second, then looked at him with something that almost felt like regret. Marcus, your father, he left something behind. Something important. And they think you have it. Marcus shook his head. That's impossible. I don't have anything of his. The woman leaned forward. Are you sure? Think. Did he leave anything with you before he disappeared? Anything at all? Marcus opened his mouth to say no, but then a memory flashed in his mind. Something buried so deep he had almost forgotten it. A box. A small, metal box his father had given him when he was little. Marcus had kept it, thinking it was nothing, a worthless piece of his past. He never opened it, never even thought about it. But now, sitting in this diner with a stranger telling him his father's past was catching up to him, Marcus realized. It wasn't nothing. The man outside suddenly moved. He reached into his coat. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. The woman's eyes widened. Marcus, she whispered. We need to go. Now. Marcus's heart pounded as the man outside reached into his coat. The woman grabbed his wrist, her fingers ice cold against his skin. We need to move, she whispered, urgency thick in her voice. Marcus could barely think. His mind was racing with everything she had just told him, his father, the past, the box. He didn't have time to process it, not with the man getting closer. Then, just as suddenly as the man had moved, the front door of the diner swung open. A police officer stepped inside. The man outside froze. His eyes flicked from Marcus to the officer, calculating. Then, as if nothing had happened, he turned and disappeared into the night. Marcus let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The woman's grip on his wrist loosened slightly, but the tension in her face didn't fade. That won't stop him for long, she said. Marcus swallowed hard. I have the box, he admitted, his voice low. At home. The woman stared at him for a second, then nodded. We need to go. Before he finds another way to get to you. Marcus knew she was right. He had never really thought about the box before, just an old metal thing his father had left behind, collecting dust under his bed. But now, it felt heavier. It meant something. And if this man was willing to chase him down for it, then whatever was inside had to be important. They left the diner quickly, keeping an eye out for any sign of the man. The streets were quieter now, but Marcus felt exposed, every shadow seeming bigger than before. By the time they reached his house, his hands were shaking as he unlocked the door. The woman followed him inside, closing it behind them. Marcus didn't hesitate. He went straight to his room, dropped to his knees, and pulled out the small, dented box from underneath his bed. It was lighter than he expected, but the moment he held it in his hands, he felt something shift inside him. The woman knelt beside him. Open it, she said softly. Marcus's fingers trembled as he unlatched the rusted lock and slowly lifted the lid. Inside, there were only a few things: an old key, a folded piece of paper, and a small photograph. Marcus picked up the picture first. His breath caught. It was of his father, younger than he remembered, standing beside another man. The same man who had been chasing them. His chest tightened. No way. The woman took the photo from him, studying it. This is him. This is the man who is following us. Marcus felt sick. What does this mean? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she picked up the folded paper, carefully unfolding it. As her eyes scanned the words, her expression darkened. Marcus leaned in. What does it say? She hesitated, then read aloud. If anything happens to me, don't trust him. Find the key. Find the truth. Marcus looked at the key in the box, his mind spinning. His father had left this for him, hidden it away for years.
But why?
What truth was he supposed to find? The woman exhaled shakily. This key, it has to lead to something. A locker, a safe, maybe even a storage unit. Marcus stared at it, feeling the weight of it in his palm. His father had been trying to protect him, even after all these years. And now it was up to him to figure out why. But as much as Marcus wanted answers, he also knew one thing for sure. He couldn't do this alone. He looked at the woman. Will you help me? She met his gaze, and for the first time since they met, she smiled. I promised your father I would. Marcus took a deep breath, gripping the key tighter. He didn't know what was coming next. He didn't know what secrets his father had left behind. But one thing was certain, his life would never be the same again.